Good afternoon. Welcome to the third episode of 4 of the CISAC Honors Program presentations. I'm Rod Ewing, a senior fellow at FSI and a co-instructor for the honors class with Professor Ziegart and Dr. Meir. I want to extend a welcome to all CISAC guests, friends, and family members who are watching these presentations. Should also note the students haven't yet finished their thesis. And so this is one last opportunity to ask a penetrating question or make constructive suggestions because there's still time to incorporate thoughts from the audience. The logistics are the presentations will be 20 minutes, followed by 10 minutes of questions. There'll be no break between the presentations so that we need to stay on schedule. Dr. Meir will be running the clock, and he will also help me monitor the questions as they arrive. For the first round of questions, I'll first recognize the advisors and then members of the seminar. And I can see them on my screen, so all you need to do is raise your hand. For the guests that are signed in and observing, you can submit your questions through the QA tab at the bottom of the screen. And then we'll get to as many of those questions as is possible in the time that we have. I think we're ready to go. So the first presentation is by Sophia Feuer. Sophia is majoring in international relations with concentrations in international security and comparative governance, and minoring in military history. She's originally from Washington, D.C., and has spent most of the majority of her academic and professional career studying South Asia and defense security problems. After graduation, she will begin her career as a geopolitical consulting firm in New York City. The title of her presentation is AK-47s, Tanks, and F-16s, Understanding Shifts in Pakistan's Conventional Military Strategy in the Post-Cold War Era. Sophia?
Thank you so much for that introduction. Hello, everybody. My name is Sophia Feuer. Thank you all for being here today. I will be presenting my honors thesis titled AK-47s, Tanks, and F-16s, Understanding Shifts in Pakistan's Conventional Military Strategy in the Post-Cold War Era. Pakistan is a central actor in many of today's most pressing security challenges. Since the founding of Pakistan, the army has been key in holding the state together and is one of the most powerful institutions in the country. The army has one of the largest standing militaries in the world, commands the nuclear arsenal of Pakistan, and is plagued with a persistent insurgency problem, all while surrounded by regional rivalries and influential states such as the US, China, and Russia in one of the most geopolitically complex regions of the world. Despite its regional and global importance, Pakistan's military remains an opaque entity, both inside and outside of the country. Little is known regarding the motivations, behavior, and strategic calculus of the Pakistan Army. States, such as the US, have struggled to maintain a relationship with Pakistan due to a lack of understanding of the behavior and strategy of the Pakistan Army. In order to understand the complex threat landscape of South Asia, an understanding of one of its central actors, the Pakistan Army, and its motivators is necessary. So this leads me to my central question. When, how, and why has Pakistan shifted its conventional military strategy in the post-Cold War era? An understanding of the behavior of the Pakistan Army and its strategic calculus will better inform US policymakers of the drivers of change within Pakistan in the future. As to my findings, I find that Pakistan has shifted its conventional military strategy 4 times in the post-Cold War era. Pakistan has pursued a post-Cold War strategy from 1989 to 1994, a defense minimal strategy from 1994 to 2001, a 2-front commitment strategy from 2001 to 2010, and finally a 3-front commitment strategy from 2010 to 2019. I find that Pakistan is a reactive and threat-based state and shifts its conventional military strategy as a result of external pressure and facilitated by bureaucratic politics. As for today's presentation, I will be walking you through my definition of conventional military strategy, a discussion of the existing literature and how I use that literature in my own empirical analysis, my findings in Pakistan's for conventional military strategy, and finally, the implications of my work. The definition of conventional military strategy varies, and in the case of Pakistan, the lines between conventional and unconventional are often blurred. For the sake of clarity, I define conventional military strategy as the operationalization of a state's armed forces to achieve a military objective and advance a state's political goals. The Pakistan Army forms a bulk of the country's military and is a key player in the country's offensive and defense capability. It's comprised of 550,000 active duty personnel, as well as 500,000 reservists. The Central Pakistan Security Making Body is GHQ, General Headquarters, and additionally, the Army has nine core headquarters, distributed throughout the country, 6 on its border towards India, 3 on its border toward Afghanistan, shown on the map to the left. So now onto a discussion of the existing literature and how I use that in my own work. There is a wide range of literature on the Pakistan Army as a general entity, and also a secondary body of scholarship that focuses on general trends and shifts in general military strategy. This work is largely theoretical. However, there is no existing empirical analysis that combines these two subsets of literature to evaluate what factors impact Pakistan's conventional military strategy. However, the literature was extremely helpful in the formulation of my 4 central hypotheses to answer the question of why Pakistan shifts its conventional military strategy. So these are the 4 central hypotheses that exist in the literature. The first is external pressure, meaning pressures emanating from the outside. I define external pressure as Indian military capability, Indian doctrine, and US policy. Secondly, internal pressure. These are pressures emanating from the inside. I define internal pressure as sectarian movements, ethnic violence, and insurgency occurring within Pakistan. Third, organizational politics. This is a combination of both organizational culture and bureaucratic politics. However, organizational culture is a difficult variable to falsify and quantify, and therefore, in testing my hypotheses empirically, I focus solely on bureaucratic politics, which I define as changes in leadership and changes in the army structure. Lastly, nuclear structure. For the sake of clarity, it's also important for me to note that I'm not looking at nuclear strategy as part of conventional military strategy. However, I am evaluating nuclear strategy as an independent variable with the potential to impact Pakistan's conventional military strategy. I define nuclear strategy as Pakistan nuclear capability and Pakistan nuclear doctrine. As for my own methodology, I conduct a single case process tracing approach in 2 distinct parts. Both parts were conducted with a year-by-year analysis from the year 1989 to 2019, as well as interviews to add nuance and fill in the gaps that data could not provide. So the first part of my research aimed to answer the question of when and how Pakistan has shifted its conventional military strategy. I determined this through a year-by-year analysis of the indicators seen on the left. The bulk of my research is shown at the bottom there with X's signifying changes in each indicator. The second part sought to explain why these shifts occur. In order to test this, I conducted the same year-by-year analysis using my independent variables that I acquired from the existing literature. Now on to my findings in Pakistan's 4 conventional military strategies. Again, I find that Pakistan has shifted its conventional military strategy 4 times in the post-Cold War era, and I find that Pakistan has shifted its conventional military strategy due to external pressure and facilitated by bureaucratic politics. In 1989, Pakistan shifted its conventional military strategy to a post-Cold War strategy. This was characterized by a defense-offense approach versus India and a policy of strategic depth in Afghanistan. Versus India, this policy relied on strong initial momentum and an inherent assumption of international intervention within a couple of weeks. So basically a fast operation. The main indicators for this strategy vis-a-vis India were increases in both strike corps and armored divisions, which are both designed to penetrate Army territory and indicate the capability to conduct successful ground offensives. Both of these increases are shown on the graphs to the left and the bottom. Additionally, during this time period, Pakistan's defense expenditure increased by 5%, which is pretty substantial. On its western border, Pakistan pursued a strategic depth policy, which I'm happy to go into a bit later. That involved a low level of monitoring of its western border and a focus of maintaining a Pakistan-friendly regime in Kabul. The main indicator of this policy towards Afghanistan was the public rhetoric of this time emanating from the army. So what caused this shift in strategy? I argue that the shift in strategy was due to external pressure and bureaucratic politics. In the 1980s, India changed its doctrine to a doctrine known as the Sundarji doctrine. I won't get into the specifics of the doctrine itself, but this contributed to a re-evaluation of strategy within Pakistan in order to try to address the strategic shift occurring in India. Secondly, this change in Indian doctrine was accompanied by a gradual military buildup in India. This was viewed as an explicit threat in Pakistan, and Pakistan sought to respond to in suit. Secondly, I argue that bureaucratic politics played a substantial role. In 1988, famed military leader Zia-ul-Haq was killed in a mysterious plane crash, thus paving the way for General Aslam Beg to take over leadership. I argue that had Zia-ul-Haq not been killed in 1988 and had continued on in his leadership role, the shift in strategy either would not have occurred at that particular time or would not have occurred at all. In 1994, Pakistan shifted its conventional military strategy once again from its post-Cold War strategy to a defense minimal strategy. This was a period of relative stasis in the evolution of Pakistan's conventional military strategy. Upon evaluation of all of the indicators I discussed earlier in my methodology, none showed any distinct shift. And so this period was particularly puzzling for me data-wise. So as for the indicators, all indicators remained the same except for a substantial decrease in military spending during this time, shown on the graph. So what can best explain this particularly puzzling period in Pakistan's military history? Well, I attribute this to three distinct factors: external, bureaucratic politics, and nuclear. Externally, during the early 1990s, India was completely focused on the rise of insurgency in Kashmir and increased violence, and therefore it wasn't putting as much pressure on Pakistan conventionally. So Pakistan faced lower conventional pressure emanating from India. Secondly, beginning in 1990, due to the Pressler Amendment, the US cut off aid to Pakistan, thus creating enormous procurement problems for Pakistan throughout the 90s. Subconventional warfare is cheaper and less diplomatically costly, and thus Pakistan focused a lot more on using proxies and insurgency during this time in order to progress its goals in Kashmir. Secondly, I argue that bureaucratic politics played a role in the strategic shift. In 1993, Pakistan changed its leadership as Chief of Army Staff once again. Again, I'm not arguing that a change in leadership explicitly caused a change in strategy. However, I am arguing that this likely facilitated a change in strategy. Third, I argue that nuclear played a role. During this time, Pakistan was increasingly focused on its nuclear program as it was preparing for its nuclear test, which ended up occurring in 1998. So this diverted attention and resources away from Pakistan's conventional operations while it was operating with an already limited amount of resources. In 2001, Pakistan shifted its conventional military strategy once again to a two-front commitment strategy. This strategy was two-pronged and involved the allocation of forces on both its eastern and western borders. On its eastern border towards India, Pakistan developed a heightened defense strategy. On its western border, Pakistan worked with US forces to conduct counterinsurgency operations as part of the US government's war on terror, evidenced by Pakistan's deployment of an unprecedented number of troops into FATA and its public rhetoric of its intention to devote large conventional capabilities to assist the United States in Afghanistan. As mentioned, the main indicators of this during this strategy shift during this time was an increased defense operation on eastern border. This was shown through military exercises that Pakistan conducted on its border with India. Secondly, the largest movement of troops into FATA since 1947. This is pretty significant. And third, an increase in Pakistan's defense expenditure, which differed starkly from the period before the defense minimal strategy. So why did this shift occur? I argue that this was due to three distinct reasons: external, bureaucratic politics, and internal. Externally, in 1999, Pakistan and India fought a war in which Pakistan invaded Indian-occupied Kashmir and Kargil. All I will really get into in this part is that this resulted in a humiliating defeat for the Pakistan Army and an enormous military failure. This likely led to Pakistan reevaluating its capabilities and its operations in order to try to address its failures from 1999. Additionally, beginning in the late 1990s, India began to increase its weapons and arms development. This likely contributed to the already present paranoia within the Pakistan Army. Third, and the factor that I argue is the most significant in this strategic period, is US pressure for the war on terror. After 9/11, Pakistan agreed to be an ally to the US, thus committing to fight a war on its western border with the US. However, this commitment was also accompanied by an enormous increase in US aid to Pakistan, and this created substantial procurement opportunities for Pakistan to funnel into its conventional military. The second factor that I argue played a role in this time period was bureaucratic politics. In 1998, there was a military coup in Pakistan led by General Musharraf. Musharraf wanted to maintain a close relationship with the US, which likely contributed to Pakistan's eagerness to assist the US. Additionally, the military now held unilateral and complete control in the country, and thus Musharraf could control the country's foreign policy agenda in any way he saw fit. In 2010, Pakistan shifted its conventional military strategy one last time to a three-front commitment strategy. This strategy represented a distinct shift from its two-pronged commitment strategy, as it was the first time Pakistan recognized internal insurgency as one of its main national security threats, and therefore one of the Army's priorities. This was codified in the Comprehensive Response Doctrine issued by the Pakistan Army in 2011, shown on the left there. So this new strategy towards India was an offensive strategy which aimed to improve the mobilization time of its troops and enhance inter-service coordination between the Army and the Air Force. However, the Army also combined this with the prioritization of counterinsurgency operations against Islamic insurgents in Fatah beginning in 2008. So the main indicators of this strategic shift was the enormous increase in large-scale military exercises during this time period aimed at increasing mobilization, which was one of its goals that it listed in the Comprehensive Response Doctrine. Secondly, a substantial increase in Pakistan's defense budget. And third, and most importantly, the Comprehensive Response Doctrine, which was the only military doctrine that was publicly available throughout the entire time period in which I studied. And it explicitly named counterinsurgency as a national security priority for the first time in Pakistan's history. So why did this shift occur? I argue that it was due to external pressure, bureaucratic politics, and internal pressure. Externally, in 2004, India shifted its conventional military strategy to a cold start doctrine, which aimed at increasing mobilization and coordination. It's no coincidence that 6 years later, Pakistan pursued a doctrine that had the same exact goals. And also the name of the doctrine explicitly citing a response to something. Additionally, this shift in India's conventional military strategy in 2004 to its cold start was accompanied by an increase in India's military capabilities, which Pakistan sought to respond to. Third, in 2008, the US began to heavily pressure Pakistan to respond to its increasing insurgency problem, which contributed to Pakistan then being coerced into having to provide a clear response. I secondly argue that bureaucratic politics played a role in this strategic shift. In 2007, General Kayani came to power as Chief of Army Staff. Kayani aimed at increasing the transparency between the Army and the civilian government. I don't think it's a coincidence that the only Army doctrine released publicly during Pakistan's post-Cold War history was under General Kayani. He additionally sought to restructure the Army hierarchy a bit, which I argue facilitated a shift in this strategy. Third, and a pretty significant factor, I argue that internal pressure played a role. Throughout the 2000s, Pakistan witnessed a substantial increase in its internal insurgency problem. And additionally, and even more importantly, the Pakistan army started receiving direct attacks by Islamic insurgencies, targeting army officers, army elements, and bases. So the Pakistan army was forced to respond to this. As a summary, here are my findings. I find the post-Cold War strategy was due to external and bureaucratic, defense minimal due to external, bureaucratic, and nuclear, two-front, external, internal, bureaucratic, and three-front, external, internal, and bureaucratic. As you can see, in every single strategic shift, it was preceded by external pressure and by a bureaucratic politics shift in the form of a change in army leadership. So as to the implications of my work. Academically, I contribute an empirical analysis to the existing military scholarship and Pakistan security literature. Additionally, my process tracing framework could theoretically be applied to other armies through conducting a year-by-year analysis in order to understand the behavior of other armies. As for the policy implications, if the assumption is that the US wants to maintain peace and stability in South Asia, the US needs to follow a carefully calibrated US security policy that balances the power dynamics existing in the region. The first actor, obviously, is Pakistan. Pakistan has been a necessary ally to the US, however, it's been a very difficult ally. So the US needs to work to find common ground within Pakistan about areas that they share, such as counterinsurgency. However, the US must also balance this with its relationship with India and the power balance between India and Pakistan. If one power, if one state feels substantially weaker than the other, it will respond in order to get on an even playing field, which is counters the US's goals in the region. Third is China. China has already shown substantial interest in claiming a foothold in the region, specifically with Pakistan, and they already have a decent number of military deals in the form of Air Force capabilities and arms. And so withdrawing completely in terms of our cooperation in South Asia is not a good option because there will be a funnel that will likely be filled by China. I'd like to take this last final moment to acknowledge my two incredible advisors, H.R. McMaster and Jilly Vardy. It's been an honor working with you guys, and you have been incredible mentors throughout this entire process. Secondly, I'd like to acknowledge the CISAC faculty, Professor Amy Ziegar and Rod Ewing. You guys have run the program spectacularly, and especially during this crazy time. And I wanted to have a special thanks to Dr. Mir, who has spent way too many hours talking to me about Pakistan, and his help has really been invaluable throughout this whole thing. Thank you, and I welcome any questions.
Right. Thank you. Sophia, if you could, yes, thank you very much.
Of course.
As is our custom, we'll first open this up to the advisors. And so, Dr. Vardy.
Thank you so much. It was such a pleasure, Sophia, and we had so many conversations about it all, but I'll ask to support my own research here. We had many conversations about sources of change. And so I wondered, and I told you my view, and I was very surprised by the findings, of course, that external pressure is so powerful here from my own experience. It's mostly internal pressure or bureaucratic pressures that are, pushing armies to change. So why do you think Pakistan represents such a different case?
That's a great question, and thank you. It's the Pakistan Army, I should note, is a very unique institution, as it has held substantial power within the country since the country's inception in 1947. And that's been accompanied by several military coups. From the beginning, in which India and Pakistan fought their first war a couple months after they became independent countries, I think that really aligned Pakistan's priorities towards an external threat. They have felt existentially threatened on all sides, specifically and obviously from India, but also the USSR that then came into Afghanistan during the 70s, which involved the US. And so I think Pakistan lives in this hotbed of external actors becoming involved and withdrawing, and with the army that has such a substantial amount of continuous power, I think it's a pretty unique case. I was actually surprised that bureaucratic politics played such a large role. I didn't expect that. And I was also surprised at the persistence of US policy in actually influencing.
All right, General McMaster.
Hey, Chris, Sophia, it's great working with you on this. I think it's a really excellent project. You've done a great job with it. You're emphasizing changes, right? Because you want to explain the changes, but certainly there are continuities as well that limit the degree to which the Pakistani army can change its doctrine. And could you describe what some of those continuities are? And do you see a tension between continuity and change in each of the shifts that you described?
Yeah, that's a great question. I think the largest continuity that exists there is first and foremost India. Even during the defense minimal period in which Pakistan faced decreased pressure from India, the only reason Pakistan faced decreased pressure was because Pakistan itself was conducting a ton of insurgency within Kashmir to disrupt India's attention. So I think the largest limit to Pakistan's ability to change, and there's been so much written about, why doesn't the army prioritize, the domestic interests of the people or other security objectives. And I think Pakistan is inherently, and in times, unfortunately, limited by its consistent paranoia of India, even in times when it's not real, it's just perceived. And I know this is the case with the US, that we have tried to work with the Pakistanis. I'm sure you can speak more to this, but we have tried to work with the Pakistanis about convincing them or providing them some type of comfort about their relationship with India. But I think the problem is that a lot of the army leadership at the very top has experienced times in which Pakistan and India were in direct conflict, like in the Kargil War, or even generals who are now in leadership in the 1971 war, in which East Pakistan declared independence. So I think its main limiter is its complete focus on India. As for continuity, with bureaucratic politics, I found that as an interesting factor, because I find that it's a necessary but insufficient condition in facilitating change, meaning it was present in every single one of the strategic shifts, but in itself, it's not enough to cause a shift. And so I think my analysis of that is that there are so many powerful people within the army hierarchy who are struggling for power, and that's shown every time there's any type of coup, or when Zia-ul-Haq was killed and there was a kind of grab for power there. So to some degree, I don't have enough publicly available information, but I think it's also limited by the amount of power-hungry people at the top of the army hierarchy.
Dr. Guttmiller?
Thanks, Sophia. That was really an interesting presentation. I learned a lot from it. I wanted to push you a bit, though, on the bureaucratic politics side of things, because in the end, you said it comes down to bureaucratic politics inside the army leadership, but my experience is from the nuclear end. And there, my experiences with General Kidwai, who's an enormously powerful and influential fighter for resources in that system. And I would think that he would have been influential in the bureaucratic politics and in fighting throughout this period that you are discussing. You talk about the nuclear developments, but in a more kind of top-line way. What about bureaucratic politics emanating from the nuclear forces and from somebody like General Kidwai?
That's a great question, and thank you so much. When I was developing the premise of this thesis, Pakistan is obviously such a unique example because it's such a powerhouse in both the nuclear component and the conventional component. and estimates vary, but as to how much of Pakistan's focus is on the nuclear versus conventional seems to be up for debate. I would imagine that so my point to that being that I came to a crossroads in which I chose to focus solely on conventional just because I felt as if I could have written an entire other thesis on Pakistan's nuclear strategy and the bureaucratic structure within the Strategic Plans Division, for example. And but I would imagine that the bureaucratic hierarchy that works in the Strategic Plans Division operates in a very similar way, in which, at least for in GHQ, for the conventional capabilities, strategy is created and evaluated by the Chief of Army Staff and then pretty much distributed among the Corps commanders who have a semi-large degree of autonomy in its implementation. And so I'm sure that the structure is somewhat similar in some ways. However, I don't have enough information to know about the explicit relationship between the top of the Army hierarchy at GHQ and the top of the Army hierarchy at the Strategic Plans Division. But that's a fascinating question that I'd love to get into.
Okay. Well, fair enough. You couldn't do both, but I do think it is a question that's worth looking at in future. Thank you very much.
Oh, thank you.
So now I'm going to be jumping back and forth between questions from the seminar participants and those from the wider audience, so I can squeeze in as much as possible. So I'll go to the wider audience, and this is a question from Morgan Kaplan. Awesome project and great presentation. I wanted to be sure to get this in. So General McMaster asked my question, so here's a new one. If you had to predict which one of your independent variables will be most influential in explaining future change in the decade to come, which would it be and why?
That's an interesting question. So I've been reading a bit about this now with the coronavirus, and there have been reports that the onset of war between Pakistan and India has become increasingly likely now that both Pakistan and India are a bit more constricted in terms of resources, and there's been increased violent movements within Kashmir, which is often the turning point there. I would have to say, frankly, that I could not see anything but India being the largest factor. However, I would be curious to see if, with the election coming up, if there's any change in US policy moving forward. Donald Trump, although he didn't pivot substantially from Obama's policy, it was a bit of a shift. And so I'd be curious to see, and especially now that we are in the midst of a withdrawal from Afghanistan, Pakistan is increasingly worried about this withdrawal from Afghanistan by the US because they're worried about influential actors in Afghanistan, and Pakistan's biggest fear is being surrounded by enemies on all sides. So I would say the biggest factors for me are going to be India, but more of a continuous thing. I'd be curious to see what happens as kind of the quarantine continues. But I'd be also curious to see, with a change in US administration, whether that also shifts it as well.
Right, thank you. We're right at the end of time, but there are two questioners remaining. So I'll ask them to pose a quick, short question. And then Sophia, you can pick and choose among the questions and give a brief answer. So Andrew?
So I wanted to ask about what you expect the effects of a potential US withdrawal from Afghanistan to be on Pakistan's military strategy. So you already addressed that briefly, but if you want to expand a little bit, I'd be really interested in hearing.
Right. And now Ben?
First of all, great work, really impressed. As for my question, I'm interested in what, if any, impact the contentious domestic politics and elections have on military strategy. Thanks.
Sorry, to clarify, US domestic politics?
No, Pakistan's elections. Yeah.
Got it. So I'll do a rapid fire for both. So as for Afghanistan, that is a big one to look out for. Pakistan has relied previously on the Taliban to check any influence in Afghanistan, which has been an extremely contentious point between the US and Pakistan. So with a withdrawal of US forces from Afghanistan, I could see Pakistan relying more and more on the Taliban in order to try to bolster its influence within Afghanistan as part of its strategic depth approach. And as to domestic politics, frankly, I don't see it having much of an effect. In terms of the civilian leadership, the Pakistan Army, at least the top leadership of the Pakistan Army, doesn't really trust civilian leadership, as they consider them kind of temporary. And so therefore they don't really trust them with national security and stuff like that. So I don't see it having a huge role. Additionally, throughout my empirical analysis, the factors internally that had the most influence in a strategic shift was increase in internal insurgency, as well as sectarian and ethnic movements sometimes. But as for political elections, I didn't see that as much.
Right, thank you. And I think we need to move on to the next presentation. So a round of applause. Okay. So the next presenter is Samantha Feuer. Samantha is from the United Kingdom. She's majoring in international relations with a minor in technology and ethics. During her time at Stanford, she's led a social entrepreneurship group, CISAC, which is an incubator for student startups. She's also conducted a project on deep fakes. After graduation, she will go to work for a private equity firm in San Francisco. The title of her presentation is From the Shadows to the Front Page, State Use of Proxies for Cyber Operations. So Samantha.
Thank you, Dr. Ewing, for that introduction. Hi, everyone. My name is Samantha Feuer, and welcome to those joining from the US, and good evening to those joining from the UK. I will be presenting my thesis to you today entitled From the Shadows to the Front Page, State Use of Cyber Proxies. 2016 represented what was a turning point. Many are aware of Russian influence into the 2016 elections, but frequently under-examined is the use of a non-state agent by the moniker of the Internet Research Agency. This agency was thought to have actually been the operational force behind the widespread influence campaign conducted on major social media sites, such as Facebook, Twitter, and Instagram. The event really brought into sharp focus the use of non-state entities to carry out national interest goals through cyber operations. However, this activity is not new, and it is not unique to Russia. Some of the most prolific actors in cyberspace include China, Iran, and North Korea, as detailed by every US national threat assessment since 2014. This slide demonstrates a number of notable cyber proxies, both hackers and groups, and their suspected state affiliations. I must mention the caveat, however, that due to the nature of the North Korean regime, it's very difficult to discern whether there's a semblance of independence between these groups and the state. Because coronavirus is on everyone's minds, actually just this Tuesday, the UK National Cybersecurity Centre and the US Cyber Infrastructure Security Agency released an advisory detailing how cyber threat actors, including what appear to be non-state actors, are targeting information of national interest within the healthcare sector. What this indicates is that this is a very present issue. Therefore, my research centers around the following question. Why do states elect to use proxies in cyber operations? From examining my hypotheses, which I shall mention briefly in the next few slides, I came to the following preliminary findings. The US has become increasingly aware of the ability of adversarial states to threaten national interests through cyber means. Nevertheless, there are a number of risks in outsourcing executionary authority to non-state actors. Additionally, all of the states that I focus on have made considerable efforts to build up their respective state cyber commands. So why among these 4 states do they elect to use cyber proxies? I find that ultimately both costs and skills and specializations may provide some explanation, but that plausible deniability benefits did not show any consistent link with the use of cyber proxies. These states in particular are able to circumvent the risks of using proxies through their internal punitive power mechanisms. In order to take you through my argument, I will first briefly define what is a cyber proxy and some trends of use. Then I will discuss my literature review and the development of my hypotheses. And finally, I will explain my research design and empirical analysis, followed by the implications of this work. So in terms of looking at what a cyber proxy actually is, the lines between state and non-state activity are increasingly blurred due to greater control and influence in civil society. Information and data localization laws in particular has given the state an inflated ability to access non-state activity. From previous studies of how states use cyber proxies, it is clear that state proxy relationships are not binary, but rather exist on a spectrum that includes both different relationships and different proxy types. Tim Mora, a notable researcher in this field, defines cyber proxies as intermediaries that conduct or directly contribute to an offensive cyber action that is enabled knowingly, whether actively or passively, by a beneficiary. I further clarify this definition through the use of the principal agent framework that's depicted on this slide, noting that a distinguishing factor between a proxy agent and a government agent that answers to its state hierarchy appears to be in the level of recognition of one another. A government agent, for example, is recognized by the state as part of the government apparatus, but a cyber proxy would not be. Similarly, a cyber proxy does not admit that they are acting under state direction. As an example, a GRU agent indicted by the United States for their role in a hack and leak operation would not be considered a cyber proxy under my definition. However, an individual hacker with no obvious employment by the state would be. In offensive cyber operations, there is a concept called the cyber kill chain, which details the usual steps taken to achieve an attacker's objectives. Within this thesis, I also further define cyber proxies as those tasked with broadly stepped delivery and beyond. Therefore, cyber proxies do not include groups that may be involved in, say, software development, but rather those that focus on the use of these technical capabilities, implicating them in the execution of the operation itself. Before I get into the why question that motivates this thesis, I want to briefly mention some examples of how cyber proxies are used. This slide demonstrates some methods and tactics enabled by these 4 states today. States appear to be using cyber proxies through all the functions listed here. Within my written thesis, I examine all of these states in turn, but for the interests of time, I will focus on China as an example. Chinese origin cyber threat actors previously identified as conducting financially motivated cybercrime appear to have shifted to dual operations, both espionage and financial. The espionage attempts have been found in a number of critical industries, including healthcare, telecoms, and the high-tech sector. It indicates that non-state cyber criminals are beginning to serve both personal and national interest goals. The 2015 cyber agreement between President Xi and President Obama depicted here appeared to subtly nod to the use of cyber proxies. The agreement included a commitment to refrain from conducting or knowingly supporting cyber-enabled theft of intellectual property. The wording of this agreement suggests that the US is aware of non-state actors that China supports. Furthermore, there have also been alleged attributions to private companies that are operating on behalf of the Chinese Ministry of State Security. One such actor was later linked to the Guangzhou Boyo Information Technology Company Limited, a Chinese cybersecurity firm that the Pentagon had previously exposed as covertly working with the Ministry of State Security. The puzzle of using proxies, however, exists in that there are downsides. To determine these, I consulted the literature on the use of proxies in the non-virtual space. An example would be Iran-funded Hezbollah. In short, as responsibility is delegated to a proxy, there is less direct control and more opportunities for information asymmetries to arise between state and proxy. This can lead to divergent interests, ineffective agents, and ultimately mission backlash. In considering these risks, I ask why states would elect to use them for cyber operations. I explored this question through 4 hypotheses. First, I discussed cost-saving mechanisms provided through outsourcing. I'm focusing on 2 main costs, both operational and economic punishment costs. Second, whether plausible deniability benefits are greater when using cyber proxies. Third, the existence of unique skills and specializations that states themselves may not be privy to. And fourth, how the penal structure of these 4 states puts them in a position to limit the risks of using cyber proxies. In terms of my research design, I employed a within-case and cross-case process tracing approach to pass my hypotheses. The timeframe of interest was from 2010 to 2019, and I focus on 4 countries, as I mentioned before: Russia, China, North Korea, and Iran. Originally, when I began this project, I sought to collect a data set of as many possible cases of cyber proxies. However, data limitations within this field are severe due to 3 main barriers. 1, the states under focus are authoritarian and some are incredibly closed regimes. Therefore, access to information proved difficult. North Korea and China, for example, proved especially difficult. 2, the intersection between cybersecurity and national security is an extremely difficult field to penetrate, even within the US. And thirdly, the lack of concrete data generates a number of uncertainties. To put this in context, a number of private cybersecurity firms informing the space is on the rise. Whilst this is good in principle, there is no systematic reporting standard among these firms, and as such, the conclusions they draw can be slightly different. Even within one firm, methods can change year on year as intelligence and technology develop. Much of the available data I was able to collect was also only from US sources. As a result of these limitations, I used an exhaustive and extensive data collection, relying on government reports and indictments, private cybersecurity firm analysis, reputable sources of news, and previous studies in relation to cyber proxies. In considering my first hypothesis, I focused on 2 costs generated by cyber operations, both operational costs and economic punishment costs. For the purposes of time, I will just discuss operational costs. To assess these, I look at publicly available data associated with Project Lakhta, part of a widespread social media influence campaign attributed to the Russian government that started in 2014 and continued till 2018. From this, I conclude that operational cost as a motivator for cyber proxy use hinges on the type of operation in question. Project Lakhta itself was a widespread campaign targeting populations within the Russian Federation and various other countries, including the United States, the European Union, and Ukraine. Many of the organizations and individuals mentioned in the indictment itself are actually considered non-state. The indictment argued that the strategic goal of the operation was to sow discord and division within the US political system. Now, if we look at the costs mentioned in this indictment, it is estimated that the total overall budget for all the operations through its entire operating period was around $34 million. But between January 2018 and around June 2018, Project Lakhta's proposed operating budget totaled around $10 million. If we dive into this period, as you can see from the table, only 0.84% of it was accounted for numerically in the indictment. This slide lists the further costs that the indictment mentioned, but did not provide numerical values for. I deemed the majority of these costs to be fixed, such that they wouldn't drastically change in value, whether attained by a proxy agent or a state agent. Only one cost stood out as a variable cost, which was administrative, a group term for buildings, utilities, and workforce. As the only variable cost, this case study suggests that the workforce required was perhaps a motivating factor for outsourcing. In this particular case, the workforce was large and required a full operating structure, including a chain of command. Internally employing all of these workers into the formal state infrastructure is unlikely to prove an efficient use of time or federal funds. My second hypothesis explores whether there is what Tim Maurer calls a revival in plausible deniability. Plausible deniability is a concept through which an actor is able to distance themselves from an action taken under their instruction. It can be used for both domestic and international audiences. In this section, I explored whether one, plausible deniability is actually feasible today, and whether two, the benefits obtained from it are enhanced through the use of cyber proxies. I assessed that there are a number of indications that show that true plausible deniability is no longer feasible. This includes technical attributions increasing in sophistication, also contextual analysis, and also reciprocal, in that the US is increasingly indicting these non-state actors and explicitly mentioning the state to which they are acting on behalf of. In spite of this lack of true plausible deniability, studies of this concept have argued that it also exists on a spectrum, from true plausible deniability on one side and unacknowledged action on behalf of one actor on the other. Therefore, it may be possible to achieve the benefits of plausible deniability under this form of implausible deniability. To assess this, I look at whether cyber proxies reduce legal liability for states. Ultimately, I determined that due to a lack of definition around the concept of cyber proxies, they may afford states less legal liability. However, I go on to explain that even in the presence of decreased legal liability, the concept of cyber warfare itself is poorly defined. And in cases where states have been held directly responsible for attacks or intrusions, there has been no clear escalatory action by the victim state. As a result, it does not seem to matter too much whether a state conducts this action or a proxy actor in obtaining these benefits of plausible deniability. The evidence is not enough to support that the use of cyber proxies specifically enhance these benefits. My third hypothesis considered how cyber proxies might provide enhanced skills or specializations that a state may not be privileged to. Whilst government bureaucracies may be ill-adapted to move quickly with the pace of cyber activity, all these states have made efforts to build up their central capabilities. Additionally, these states also appear to have less oversight on some of their government agencies than others than perhaps the US does. However, there are also reports that, like many bureaucracies, Iran and Russia specifically suffer from overlap, creating bottlenecks and missteps, which could be resolved through outsourcing to cyber proxies. Furthermore, Recorded Future, a prominent US intelligence firm, reports that in Iran, there are over 50 estimated contractors vying for government-sponsored offensive cyber projects. Such an approach indicates that Iran is looking to benefit from the market forces that result in competition, thus providing high quality and specialized proxy agents. If true, it indicates that skills and specializations of cyber proxies may explain why Iran uses them. My fourth hypothesis considered the state's ability to control their proxies in the presence of principal agent dilemmas. Whilst coercion can take the form of both incentives and punishment, I focus on the latter and determine it as punitive power, which I define as the state's ability to punish proxy actors for misbehavior or failure. I use 4 indicators of state punitive power to assess whether these states can adequately control their proxies, which are illustrated in this table here. To assess that I assess in conclusion that internal power is consistent among all these states, both informally and formally. Yet external formal power is lacking. To demonstrate this, I compiled a small n data set of competing extradition cases between the US and Russia in cyber-related offenses. I found that in all but one of these cases, Russia failed to extradite its own citizen back to Russia. Whilst Russia, North Korea, and Iran all have notable cases of using informal external power, it seems that generally all these states are lacking in external power. And as a result, this may suggest that it is internal power that drives the use of cyber proxies. It follows, therefore, that when constructing a cyber proxy strategy, states may decide to only employ these proxies within their judicial territories in order to better exercise this internal punitive power. With the evidence available, I therefore assess that states may use cyber proxies due to costs and skills and specializations, but the evidence is not enough to show that plausible deniability benefits are enhanced through the use of cyber proxies. I also assess that these states control their cyber proxies through internal punitive power. The implications of this work lie in both scholarship and policy. In terms of scholarship, I provide a framework for future researchers with better data to assess these variables, and I also provide an addition to the limited literature within this space. In terms of policy, I provide an indication of the motivations for the use of cyber proxies and how certain states may continue to inflate or reduce their role in the presence of changing or unchanging international standards and norms. Finally, I just want to express my extreme gratitude to my wonderful thesis advisors, Professor Grotto and Dr. Amy Ziegart, and the incredible CISAC teaching team, Dr. Ziegart, Dr. Ewing, and Dr. Asfandi Amir. I also want to express my thanks to my family, friends, and the CISAC Honors Cohort for letting me freak them out the entire year about how they may be hacked at any minute. Thank you, and I'm happy to take questions.
First question goes to Andy Grotto.
Great. Well, thanks, Rod. It's good to see everyone, albeit virtually. Sam, great job. It's been a pleasure working with you on this project. I've certainly learned a lot and have enjoyed watching this thesis come together. Sort of two questions for you. One is, when you talk about plausible deniability, you alluded to the fact that there can be multiple audiences for deniability. There can be both an internal audience as well as an external foreign audience. You also mentioned early in your presentation how informatization and in particular the ability of these four states to shape the political and information landscape within their polities is a source of influence for them. How do you see plausible deniability internally interacting with that ability of a state like Russia, for example, to exert some substantial influence over how even things that seem implausible to us may ring true there? And the second question concerns the internal, external, formal, informal matrix. I love the concept. I wanted to know can you say a little bit more about how you measure each of those variables? And I mean, it's a qualitative exercise, I understand, but I'd love to hear a little more, hear you elaborate on how you go about making that measurement.
Absolutely, and thank you for your questions and your help throughout. It's been a great journey. So in terms of your first question, as far as are you asking specifically in terms of in relation to the use of cyber proxies in attaining this internal plausible deniability, just to clarify?
Yeah.
Okay, so your first question, I think from my thesis, one of the most interesting parts was looking at this plausible deniability aspect. And I think that in terms of using cyber proxies, what I tended to see that even internally, whether for example, the US indicts directly GRU agents, the Russian government will still come out and say, oh, this is fake. This is, it's got nothing to do with us. This is all propaganda. And so whether or not there's an internal benefit, does not seem to be enhanced through that use of a cyber proxy. However, obviously, I'm a little bit limited in the ability to assess this because I'm not in Russia, for example. I can't get a perception of how well or how not average Russian citizens perceive these statements from the Russian government. And I would imagine, however, that due to this control over civil society, there isn't much backlash internally from these specific incidences. I think it's also enhanced by the fact that cyber incidences are typically very unclear when it comes to generalized reporting. And that's something I've definitely seen myself. And I don't think that would be any different potentially internally within inside Russia. In terms of your second question of how I came up with this matrix, some of the things that I used to measure both internal and external, formal and informal punitive power. So internal and formal power, I looked at through, for example, travel bans that are instated by the government. This has been widely used in particularly Russia to stop state agents particularly from leaving the country. And then in terms of internal informal, I looked at the concept of black jails, which have been used widely in China to prevent dissidents and also complaints getting through to the government. And then in terms of external formal power, I look at those extradition treaties that I analyze, particularly in the case of Russia and the United States, where there have been this competing extradition cases. And then external informal power, it's something that I'm still getting to grips with, but looks a lot at extraterritorial assassinations and kidnappings abroad with the best available data I can find.
All right, Professor Ziegart.
Well, great job, Samantha. This has been a really hard thesis, given the data challenges you've had, and you've done a great job in pulling it off. I have a question about, you spent a lot of time in the thesis, and you've gotten a lot of mileage out of looking at what makes these 4 states' use of cyber proxies the same. So I want to ask you to talk a little bit more about differences in how Russia, China, Iran, and North Korea use cyber proxies. You found, I know, that there are differences, but can you talk also about, do you think those differences are enduring or are they fleeting? Especially as we think about the use of the Chinese use of misinformation in COVID-19, how do we think about the differences between these 4 states and whether they're actually likely to continue?
Yeah, I mean, I thank you also for your help along the way. I've really enjoyed every minute. In terms of your question, yeah, I think it's something that's very fascinating to look at. When I actually began this project, I could see the differences more clearly back in September of last year. But as we've gone even throughout this year and the reporting has increased, or awareness of cyber security generally has increased due to even the situation we're in right now, where a lot of our lives have moved online, you're actually beginning to see these divergences, these convergences among these states, where whereas before China was very involved in, say, IP theft or information theft from universities, for example, now it's also starting to move more heavily into this influence space. And where Russia began in more of an influence space and also disruption and destruction space, it's now also beginning to, for example, with the case of COVID, look into the more espionage case and intellectual property case. With North Korea, it's still very difficult to ascertain exactly, but particularly for them, they do engage what seems to be financially motivated crimes on behalf of the state to build up make up for economic failings. And with Iran, they also seem to be mimicking sort of the structure of Russia and China in terms of what they're trying to do with their cyber proxies.
All right, now we'll turn to the class. Antigone?
Congratulations, Sam, on a job well done, and especially for picking a thesis that is really sort of cutting edge and uncharted in terms of data out there. So you spoke about why states and seems clear. Did my internet cut out?
Yes, it's cutting
Hello?
out. Try again, please.
Sorry about that. I was just, what I was saying was that you spoke about why states use cyber proxies, and there are some clear commonalities between the states you discussed, namely none of them are democratic. I'm wondering, do you see a lesser use of cyber proxies by democratic states? And if so, why would you think that non-democratic states are more inclined to use them in their cyber operations?
Thank you, Antigone. I think it's the reason I focused on non-democratic states is because of the available data I'm able to ascertain, particularly from US sources, is very much slanted towards looking at threats rather than the other way around. And as a result, I wasn't able to do too much digging into the way that the US structures its cyber strategy. However, that being said, from what I have been told from conversations with people, the US doesn't use cyber proxies in the same way that I define them, particularly within the use of these countries. And I think the reason that these states are using potentially these cyber proxies in a different way than other democratic nations might use them is because currently there may be a few asymmetric disadvantages that they are at, particularly militarily in the case of Russia. China, I know it's getting on to parity in some ways, but I think there's still like an asymmetry there that can be made up through the use of this covert, very difficult to define strategy. And it is really the domain itself that is giving weight to the use of these agents in order to bolster a lack of capability in other areas.
Right, thank you. We've got at least 2 more questions left, so I'd ask that they be concise as well as the answer. So, Jonah?
Samantha, congratulations. You did an amazing job. I have a question about cyber operations and strategy. There's been some talk in the policy community of states that have been the targets of operations now going on the offensive. So I'm wondering what your take is in terms of the viability of, strategies like coercion or deterrence. And should the United States, what's your prescription? Should the United States or the UK go on the offensive with information operations, and should we use proxies?
Oh, wow. Great question. I don't think that I personally don't think I would recommend a completely offensive policy like those that I talk about here. I think it really requires, and it's something that we don't see right now, international norms and also more red lines to be set potentially within policy. But I don't think that we should be potentially as aggressive because who knows, at the moment we haven't seen escalatory action, but that could change. And I also think that to your second question, was there a second part? Did you mention?
Oh, I said if yes, should we use proxies? But
I wouldn't say that in the way currently that the way that I define them as such here. I think that it's within our interest to limit and control the environment, not enhance it in some ways.
Right, thank you. I'll move now to the broader audience. This will be the last question. It's from Kinsey Inman. Do you believe the use of cyber proxies will continue to be the preferred mechanism of cyber strategy execution? Or do you see a world in which these states begin to take the burden of the execution upon themselves? And if the latter, what factors would make this change possible?
Thank you, Kenzie. So I think that at this current point, with the variables that I identify as potentially motivating, such as cost and skills and specializations, particularly with the increasing use of influence campaigns, these proxies will probably continue to be used within cyber strategy execution. However, as I mentioned, there are some dilemmas involved. And so it may be the case that in instances when there are more targeted, and this is something I saw generally, in more targeted operations against specific targets or in critical infrastructure when it's very sensitive and requires perhaps more oversight, that the states will start to bring in those capabilities internally. And this is evidenced just through an internal buildup of these capabilities, as we've seen over the last 10 years.
Right, thank you. And My apologies because I'm leaving a few questions on the table, but we need to move on. So a round of applause for Samantha. Okay. The next presentation is by Elena Crespo. Elena's from San Diego. She's majoring in political science and minoring in human rights. In the fall of her junior year, she worked to communicate alignments between public diplomacy programs and national security goals in the policy office of the Bureau of Educational and Cultural Affairs at the State Department. During her summer, she's worked to understand and promote democratic cultures in Brazil and Myanmar. And in addition, I note that she's performed in the Gaieties, which is an original musical production held each year on the occasion of the big game. So she's been busy in all aspects of college life. The title of her presentation is Blood and Treasure, but mostly blood, U.S. Electoral Accountability and the All-Volunteer Force. Elena, it's all yours.
Okay, thank you so much, Professor Ewing. So before I begin, I'd like to talk about a moment in my thesis process where I felt the most clarity about the importance of the research. Every year, the CISAC honors cohort takes a trip to Washington, D.C., and while we were there, we were given a tour of Arlington National Cemetery by members of the active duty Special Forces community. Our visit ended in Section 60, a 14-acre section of land put aside at the beginning of the war in Afghanistan for those who would die in combat. While standing in Section 60, I realized that many of the people who were buried were my age, and I was struck by how different our wartime experiences were. They had died for our foreign policy while my life remained relatively untouched by the post 9/11 wars on a day-to-day basis. So for me, this was a really grounding moment to consider the ramifications of US foreign policy, as well as inequality in who is paying the cost of that policy. So with this in mind, the question guiding my research is how do military manpower systems impact electoral accountability for war in the United States? Manpower systems being how we staff our military, whether that's through conscription, the draft, or through volunteerism. And when I say electoral accountability, I mean that representatives are held accountable for how their voters feel about the choices that they are making through elections. So to answer this question, I conduct a counterfactual analysis of the post 9/11 wars had they been fought with a conscripted force. And conventional logic would suggest that conscription would increase political consequences on representatives for war, but my findings were actually the opposite, that conscription decreases political consequences for war in certain cases. And I'll explore these findings throughout my presentation. Today, I'll begin with a discussion of my hypotheses going into the project and the relevant literature that informed them. Then I'll present my methodology for creating this aforementioned counterfactual scenario of the post 9/11 wars with different military manpower systems before moving on to my findings. And I'll be focusing on one of the three case studies I present in my thesis, the 2006 Senate election, before turning to the contributions my thesis makes to scholarship, policy, and politics. For the purposes of understanding the impact of military manpower systems on electoral politics in the US, I've developed two hypotheses. First, with a conscripted force, American casualties in Iraq and Afghanistan would have been more equally distributed throughout the United States. And the first really acts as a mechanism for my second hypothesis, which is that incumbents and the ruling party would have faced greater electoral opposition if the post 9/11 wars were fought with a conscripted force. So basically, when you evenly distribute casualties across the US, more voters tangibly feel the cost of war. So they have a greater incentive to oppose pro-war policies from the party in power. The ruling party is the party in power. And in developing my hypotheses, I turned to literature on international relations, political science, and American politics. And I found three schools of thought that were most relevant, these three. So under a theoretical framework of the relationship between democracy and war, institutions, particularly elections, should constrain leaders with militaristic foreign policy. And that's because citizens are the ones paying the cost of war in terms of blood and treasure. Hence my thesis title, which is really just to say casualties and taxes. So the most obvious and personal indicator of cost of war to the voters is casualties, particularly local casualties. The proximate casualty hypothesis suggests that local casualties contribute explanatory power in understanding public sentiment towards war much beyond national casualties. And that's because these are very publicized events in the local context. They end up in newspapers. They're published on local media sources. And yet currently, casualties are not equally distributed, geographically speaking, across the United States. This means that there's inequality in sacrifice, and people across the US feel the costs of war differently depending on where they live. And so these are the schools of thought that have informed my two hypotheses. I explored these hypotheses through a rather experimental methodology. I present a counterfactual analysis of the wars in Iraq and Afghanistan had they been fought with a partially conscripted or wholly conscripted force. As you know, they were fought with an all-volunteer force in reality. And so there's a three-step process to generating the data used in each of the case studies I present in my thesis. First, I build a model that explains the relationship between casualty rates in a given state and electoral outcomes for the incumbent or incumbent party. These are the people seen most responsible for war. And the models that I use are all derivatives of peer-reviewed papers that show approximate casualty effect in different elections. So this is an example. The numbers aren't particularly important, but just to show you what one of my models looks like. Looking at the top, you can see I'm examining the impact of Iraq state casualty rates on the percent of the vote share captured by GOP candidates, the ruling party in this case, in the 2006 Senate race. I also include a variety of political, economic, and demographic variables that also explain how well the GOP candidates did, so I can isolate the effect of casualty rates at the state level. And so you can see across all my models, I find a negative relationship between casualty rates and incumbent vote share, meaning that where there are more casualties, the ruling party or the candidates of the ruling party is likely to do worse. After creating this model, I can turn to the second step, which is distributing casualties differently across states based on what could be expected with different military manpower systems. That's what you see here. Here are three different models of how casualties would have been distributed across the US had the post 9/11 wars been fought with different types of forces. And I'll return specifically to the distributions and what motivates them shortly. But what's important to recognize here is that these distributions translate directly into the number of casualties expected in each state and the casualty rates in each state expected. And so this is two different representations, one a numerical representation of state casualty rates, and then a more visual representation. This takes me to the third step of creating my counterfactual, generating predicted electoral outcomes. So by looking at the way distribution of casualties impacts elections, I'm able to calibrate how meaningful the effects of military manpower systems are. This step combines the first two steps. I take the state casualty rates found by geographically redistributing casualties to what could have been expected with a different military manpower system, and then I plug them into the model that I built of the relationship between casualties and electoral outcomes, and I get something that looks like this. In the green box, you see expected vote shares at the state level based upon which military manpower system was employed. Lastly, before getting to my analysis, I want to discuss some of the assumptions in this approach. The largest one is that the only thing changing when I change the military manpower systems is the geographic distribution of casualties across the US. Everything else has to stay the same: the way the wars fought, the total number of casualties suffered, the media portrayal of these costs of war. And I realize that this is a tenuous assumption, but it's also necessary for the scope of my project to get a baseline for one way that military manpower systems impact the US, the geographic distribution of cost of war. So moving on to the way I analyzed my findings. I analyzed 3 different military manpower systems across 3 different elections and asked 3 different questions. I first analyzed the real casualty distribution from an all-volunteer force. That's what we have, that's how Iraq and Afghanistan were fought. And I compare that to 2 different conscription scenarios. First is a partially conscripted force. To create this distribution, I leaned on the distribution of casualties during the Vietnam War, and I took the casualty rate experienced in Vietnam per state, adjusted for population growth. Vietnam is the most recent war the US fought with draftees, and 25% of the force in the combat zone was conscripted. I also consider a wholly conscripted force, where the force is drafted equally from each state based on population. And this is more of a thought experiment than a realistic interpretation of what the draft looks like. I then consider, three different elections: the presidential election of 2004, the Senate election of 2006, and the presidential election of 2016. And I ask three questions. In which areas did vote shares change? Where were these vote changes significant? And where were they decisive? Transitioning to my findings, I'm going to start by discussing my first hypothesis. As a refresher, it's that with the conscripted force, American casualties in Iraq and Afghanistan would have been more equally distributed throughout the United States. My findings are consistent with this first hypothesis. On this slide, you can see a visual representation of how casualties from the wars in Iraq and Afghanistan between 2001 and 2016 could have been distributed based on three different military manpower systems. On the top left, you'll see what actually happened under the all-volunteer force. Note that in this graph, you see the greatest number of what I would call states with extreme casualty rates, strong deviations from the mean, whether that's extremely high, as seen in dark red in Vermont and some of the Great Plains states, or whether that's extremely low, which is seen in white and pink. Moving across the screen to the top right of the corner, or to the top right corner, you'll see one possible representation of how the casualty distribution of a partially conscripted force would shake out. Again, this is a derivative of the Vietnam distribution. There are still some states, particularly West Virginia and Nevada, that stick out with extreme casualty rates, whether high or low. But the states overall are more in the medium red range, which means that there's greater parity in casualty rates and you're moving more towards the mean. More states are sharing more average casualty rates. And then turning to the bottom, you'll find a representation of uniformity in casualty rates across the whole United States. This is the wholly conscripted force, where all states would experience casualty rates of about 21 casualties per 1 million residents. Turning to my second hypothesis, what does this greater equality in casualty rates mean for electoral outcomes? In my thesis, I test this hypothesis through 3 case studies of elections. And as a reminder, that hypothesis is incumbents in the ruling party would have faced greater electoral opposition if the post 9/11 wars were fought with a conscripted force. And so today I'm going to focus on one case study, the Senate races of 2006. To provide some context, 2006 was a crucial year in the Senate. The Democrats took control of the chamber by picking up 5 seats for the party, and additionally 2 independents won seats in the Senate, which caused the Democrats to take control. They're often credited by being able to accomplish this by nationalizing the election and making it all about the war in Iraq. And I posit that yes, the issues might have been national, but the resentment that generated the seat flips was local. And so the big question here is, what would things have looked like? Would they have been different in 06 with a conscripted force? And so what I would expect to see under my second hypothesis is that the Democrats would have done even better with a conscripted force, as a more equally distributed cost of war would have harmed Republican incumbents. The Republicans were the ruling party at the time in more states. And here's what I found. So what's going on in this slide. In the graph on the left-hand side, you see the vote shares received by GOP candidates in the 2006 election in a couple of different states. This is when the war in Iraq was fought with an all-volunteer force. And on the right, you have the expected vote shares the GOP candidates could have received had the post 9/11 wars been fought with a partially conscripted force. So focusing on partially conscripted force in this case. And this is based on the Vietnam era distribution of casualties. Again, I chose to highlight these particular states, the 5 of them, as places where manpower systems could have decisively impacted electoral outcomes. There are 4 battleground states, as well as Vermont. So the red lines are places where the GOP vote share would have been less with a conscripted force than the GOP candidates actually received under an all-volunteer force. Specifically, Virginia and Missouri. These are states that had less than their fair share of casualties under an all-volunteer force, that would have experienced more casualties under a conscripted force. And as a result, greater voter dissatisfaction with the ruling party supporting President Bush and GOP candidates suffer. The green lines show the opposite effect. These are places where the electoral performance of GOP candidates would have gone up. So in the cases of Vermont and Montana, these increases would have been decisive, meaning that GOP candidates that lost their election could have actually won their races. And the changes in Vermont and Montana can be explained by the graph on the right. In both cases, moving to a conscripted force would have decreased state casualty rates in Vermont quite significantly, and that could have raised voter satisfaction with the ruling party. So in the context of 2006, this 2-seat flip is huge. In 2006, GOP retention of 1 seat would have allowed the party to retain control of the Senate because they had the executive branch. And specifically, had the war in Iraq been fought with a conscripted force, we could have expected a gain of 2 seats. So how does this align with my expectations? If you turn to my second hypothesis, I predicted that conscription would bring greater electoral opposition to the ruling party. And in the case of 2006, the ruling party is the GOP in the Senate and in the White House. They're the party seen as most responsible for the war in Iraq, and yet we see the ruling party gaining seats, which is the opposite of what I predicted. When you move to a conscripted force, casualties actually become more dispersed across the US, as we saw, instead of concentrated in places that happen to have competitive elections, one of the idiosyncrasies of the US system. And the distribution dilutes the effect in any one particular place, allowing the ruling party to do better electorally. And this finding holds through all 3 case studies that I consider. In all 3 case studies, the ruling party is held most accountable under an all-volunteer force, rather than a partially conscripted or wholly conscripted force. And I'm happy to talk through the other case studies during the Q&A session, but for now I want to turn to the implications of my work. My thesis has implications across 3 domains: scholarship, policy, and politics. Currently, literature on democracy, conscription, and war constraints focuses heavily on survey experiments of hypothetical wars and how people would feel with conscription in place versus volunteerism. And to my knowledge, my thesis is the first study of its kind to develop a counterfactual scenario of the same war fought through different military manpower systems. My experimentation with different distributions of casualties has policy implications that really transcend conversations of military manpower systems. Essentially, what I found was that moving to a conscripted force dispersed an already small number of casualties relative to the overall population of the US. And this phenomenon isn't unique to conscription. As the US turns towards technological force multipliers, like autonomous weapon systems, it's likely casualties will further decrease when the US is involved in conflict. Of course, the protection of American soldiers is something we should strive for, but my research raises serious concerns about the efficacy of democratic constraints on war if citizens don't feel the cost of war. And this could give way to a more militaristic foreign policy. And lastly, as it stands, casualties are concentrated in very politically important swing states. This presents an opportunity for the Democratic Party and for the Republican Party to recapture a small but decisive voting bloc. In closing, I would like to thank my advisor, Professor Schultz, for his constant guidance, patience, and support. I'd also like to thank our teaching team, Professor Ewing, Professor Ziegert, and Dr. Meir, for helping me think through so many different iterations of my thesis and pushing me to produce my best quality work. And finally, I'd like to thank my mentors, cohort, friends, and family. Thank you not only for being here today, but for supporting me throughout the entire year. I often like to joke that I invited everyone who had to listen to me whine about my thesis, but honestly, that's truer than I can tell you. So from the bottom of my heart, I really appreciate you all. With that, I am ready to turn to questions.
The first question goes to Professor Schultz.
I'll be quick because it looks like there's some students who want to ask questions too. So Elena, excellent job with that presentation. We've talked a lot. I guess I'm going to ask you a question that kind of pulls you a little bit outside. So you make a bunch of assumptions in order for this counterfactual to go through. Which is the one that keeps you up most at night?
I think the one that I find the least believable is that conscription, basically I have to assume that through casualties in different states, they'll have the same effect if they were conscripted casualties versus all volunteer casualties. And there's actually some data that suggests that people are more averse to casualties, or people in the US are more averse to casualties with a conscripted force. And so there is a chance, definitely a non-zero chance, that if there was a conscripted force, people would be more averse, which would throw my models off a little bit.
Andrew?
Thank you, Elena, for a really great presentation. Super interesting subject. So one of the things that I've been most fascinated about has been your research design. And so I was curious if you could speak a little bit about how that could potentially be applied to other projects and sort of the impact on their scholarship from that contribution.
Absolutely. Well, one of the things that I would love to do if I were to extend the project is to look at it through more elections. So I think that the idea of using a model that shows an effect, like the effect of casualties on electoral outcomes being used as a prediction is something that we could potentially use in the future as well. It'd be to look at the impact of cost of war on future elections. And so, as well as all of the elections between 2006 and 2016.
Brian?
Thank you, and fantastic job on this presentation, Elena. As you presented, one of your key findings is that if these post 9/11 wars had been fought with an all conscript force, we wouldn't have seen a greater opposition, as your hypothesis suggests, but rather a decrease. As I understand it, and as you allude to a number of times, the unique nature of the American electoral system, the electoral college at the presidential level and the way we elect senators as well, plays arguably a determinative role in producing this outcome. So I was wondering if you could talk a bit more about that and the effect of America's somewhat unique electoral system, and how your thesis has affected your thinking around this issue, if at all. Would the story be different if we had a different electoral system?
Absolutely. This is something that I have thought quite a bit about, and just because of the nature of the US political system, as you alluded to, some states matter more or more influential. And so as I went into my thesis, I figured that states or the casualties would be redistributed from places in where they're disproportionately represented, often in the South, in the Great Plains, and they would be redistributed to places where they would have a larger effect on electoral outcomes, places that are more casualty averse in the Northeast, California, et cetera. And that is what I found ultimately. But the thing is, then most states, elections aren't contested. They are fairly predetermined, and states that go red will consistently go red, and states that go blue will consistently go blue. And so when we redistribute casualties, let's say from Tennessee to New Hampshire, it doesn't have a massive political effect because New Hampshire was going to be blue anyways. And so I find that the effects are most pronounced in places where there are very small electoral margins, and just so happens that the way that casualties are distributed right now, those are in places that are politically important. They're in swing states. And so when you take casualties out of those swing states, it means that the ruling party does better. So it really is very unique. So if we were to have a different electoral system, I think you would have the opposite effect, or you would see the opposite effect if we were perhaps to have a system with a general election being held through, what's the word I'm looking for? If we were to have a popular vote, there we go, presidential election, you would probably see the opposite effect.
Right, thank you. Jonah?
Elena, amazing job, congratulations. My question's about the future of military manpower systems. I'm wondering, as new technologies change the nature of war, what might the implications be for these systems and political sensitivities to casualties? Do you expect your findings to become even more relevant or react in different ways?
Right. So I alluded to this a little bit at the end of my presentation, but I think as we consider the future of war, we're likely to see greater dependence on technologies that minimize casualties for US soldiers. And while I think that that is a wonderful thing, it also means that casualties are a very salient way that the public experiences the cost of war and has an understanding and incentive to pay attention to US foreign policy, an incentive to hold our leaders accountable for their political choices. And so as we move to a system of fighting wars where we are less casualty prone, we further reduce how the American public will experience war and feel the cost of war. So you could very likely see a similar effect to what happens when I move to a conscript force in the swing states. You reduce the overall number of casualties and you see even less political accountability.
Right, Eva?
Yeah, so first of all, great job, super interesting. I was just curious about something that you've said a couple of times, which is that it just so happens that there are higher casualties in swing states. And I wanted to ask you whether you think that that is just a fluke of chance, or whether maybe it is that these states become swing states because with higher casualties, you want to hold your politicians more accountable, or if there's some causational or correlative link there.
So when I say it just so happens that these casualties are located in swing states, it's not necessarily true that it just so happens. There are several indicators that increase the number, or they increase someone's propensity to enlist. So the number of casualties is dependent on what percentage of the force a state is making up right now. And some of the indicators that increase a likelihood of enlisting, one of the biggest determinants is family ties to the military. So it makes sense that overall, these states are going to be producing a greater and greater share of the enlisted force as well as the casualties because it's a reproducible cycle. And so I'm not sure if that necessarily relates specifically to the political context of these states being swing states, but it definitely makes sense of why you're seeing enclaves where casualties are more and more concentrated.
Rose Scott Miller.
Thank you, Elena. That was really interesting. I was actually quite horrified by the map of the United States you had showing actually what the laydown is nowadays with the system that we currently have. It's a pretty horrifying picture. My question is related to Brian's and Eva's, and that is, do you see the effect of what you've discovered being exacerbated over time through additional election cycles, assuming that in fact, we continue to be tangled up in foreign conflict? I agree we may be heading out of Afghanistan, but frankly, I don't see us not being entangled in some foreign conflicts going forward. But I'd be interested in your view. Will this set of effects be exacerbated over time? Thanks.
Well, as I was alluding to in my answer to the previous question, I see us moving towards greater dependence on the same enclaves of where the current force is being drawn from. And I think that that's a trend that's only going to continue. So we'll rely more and more on the same communities to staff our force. And so moving forward from an electoral perspective, I think that the 2016 election is actually a very good indicator. Trump campaigned on being against against US entanglement abroad. And I think that's something that resonated very much with these communities that are paying high cost of war. And that's why when I consider the 2016 election, I find that if casualties were reduced in these enclaves, Clinton would have done significantly better, actually likely winning or possibly winning Florida and Arizona. So I think that as we continue to be involved abroad, depending on that involvement, depending on how casualty prone that involvement is, we will see more of the same.
All right, I'm going to take a few questions from the broader audience and from Joshua Adamson. Did you look at congressional races? Did these patterns continue at a more local level?
So I did not look at congressional races, and that's a place I've identified for additional scholarship, something I would really like to consider. One of the big barriers through my approach is that I use 1970 population data and casualty distributions from the Vietnam War, and congressional districts have changed since then. So it's very difficult to locate casualties that would be in congressional districts now versus then. And that was one of the barriers to me doing that in this particular project. But I think it would be really interesting, and literature does suggest and as you localize the effect further, you might see an opposite effect.
All right. Thank you. From Sydney Frankenberg, amazing presentation. How did you consider women being exempted from conscription in your models or in your hypotheses? How do you think people's perception of war would change in a scenario where both men and women are conscripted?
That's really interesting. So it's not a variable that I took into consideration when I was working through my models. So the models that I built were based on the impact of casualties from the wars in Iraq and Afghanistan on electoral outcomes in 2004, 2006, and 2016. So these are models that that include women being involved women being in the military And so I didn't consider necessarily how there would be a cultural shift or opinion shift based upon the conscription of women. But I think that speaks to a larger discussion on the limitations of my approach. And one of the major limitations, as I noted earlier, is that people feel different inherently about conscripted casualties than volunteer-based casualties, and they are more likely to be upset about conscripted casualties. And that could be even more so the case when you consider drafting women. And that's also an area that my research could be improved and expanded upon.
Okay, I'll go back to the class. Are there questions from the class members before I go back to the larger audience? Just raise your hand if you have a question. All right, from the larger audience, from Joe D. Jacob. Great job, Elena, very proud of you. Not covered in your data is the contribution of US citizens from US territories. Though small, the island of Guam lost more soldiers as a percentage of population in Vietnam than any other state.
Yes. So that is something that is available when I look at the data from the Vietnam War, but is not necessarily, or wasn't included in the models that I based my model off of. So I tried to follow the models from peer-reviewed papers that show the effect of casualties on electoral outcomes in 2004, 2006, and 2016. And those were casualties that were casualties from the Iraq War and the war in Afghanistan from these territories were excluded within these models. So I made the choice to also exclude them from my models, particularly because when we consider the election, all the territories have the same ability to participate across Senate elections as well as presidential elections.
Okay. Actually, I'd like to ask what will probably be the last question. And I'm speaking as someone who was conscripted. You're finding that conscription does not create electoral opposition to the ruling party is really interesting. Could you comment on the Vietnam era where the anti-war movement caused, in fact, President Johnson to decide not to run for the presidency? How does that relate to your findings?
Absolutely. So I want to qualify my findings, particularly by saying that I think there's a major limitation in the number of casualties to consider. So when we look at the Vietnam War, there were 56,000 plus casualties, whereas we look at about the cost of Iraq and Afghanistan from 2001 to 2016, there were a little bit over 6,000. And so I think the sheer number of the magnitude of casualties experienced by the nation as a whole kind of precludes any sort of collective action around opposition to the war. However, I do think, as I've mentioned a couple of times, there's a very well documented effect saying that people are more averse to casualties, as well as people with a personal interest in whether or not we move back to a conscripted force are more averse to casualties of a conscripted kind because they have a personal interest in avoiding going to war. And so I think that there are a couple of different reasons why you see a very different political effect. And some of them are related to the distribution of casualties, but some of them are related to just the nature of the wars. And that's why I think that it's a trend that we'll continue to see greater apathy overall as we move into times where conflict is even more or less prone to casualties.
Right, let me check with Dr. Meir. We're at the end of our time, correct? He says stop. So apologies to the few questions that are still remaining, but great congratulations to all three of the presenters, and I can assure you the teaching team looks forward to reading the completed thesis. So thank you all very much.